This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. Our first formal dinner since 2020 took place on March the 30th, when Reserve Forces Night honored Brigadier General Peter Scott, the commander of 4th Canadian Division.
Thank you. General Scott, members of the head table, we're going to toast to the Ukraine in just a moment. And what we're going to say is we're going to say, glory to the Ukraine, and you're going to say back to me, glory to the heroes. But we're going to do it in Ukrainian, so we're going to have to rehearse it just once so that we get it all right. So my part, I'm going to say, Slava Ukraini, and you're going to say back to me, Slava Heroyam. It's like hero with a yam on the end of it. So let's practice it once. Slava Ukraini.
Герой Україні.
Ladies and gentlemen, Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.
Introduce our guest of honor and speaker, Brigadier General Peter K. Scott, CD. And let me tell you a little bit about him, or a lot. Brigadier General Peter Scott was born in Northern Ireland and grew up in Kincardine, Ontario. Enrolling in the Canadian Armed Forces in 1990, he graduated from the Royal Military College in 1994 and was commissioned as an infantry officer into the Royal Canadian Regiment. He's had the privilege of commanding at every rank level, most notably commanding the 1st Battalion of the Royal Canadian Regiment from 2011 to 2012, the Canadian Maneuver Training Centre from 2016 to 2018, and now the 4th Canadian Division. Brigadier General Scott has participated in 6 operational deployments throughout his career, including United Nations Protection Force in Croatia in 1994-5, the NATO Stabilization Force in Bosnia in 1998, the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan in 2005, and again from 2013 to 2014. He was also deployed to Ramallah in the West Bank in 2010 as part of the capacity building efforts of Op Proteus under the United States Security Coordination, USSC, and had the honor of returning to this mission again in 2019 to be appointed as the Deputy Coordinator for USCC and Commander Task Force Jerusalem. Throughout his career, Brigadier General Scott has held a variety of staff positions, including appointments at the battalion and brigade level, working on Army projects in the Directorate of Land Requirements, Chief of Staff to the Director General Land Capability Development, Infantry and Combat Arms Career Manager, directing staff at the Army Staff College, the Canadian Army G3, and the Regimental Colonel of the Royal Canadian Regiment. Most recently, he was employed as the Director General of Operations in the Strategic Joint Staff, providing timely military analysis and decision support to the Chief of Defense Staff. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Commerce and a Master of Defense Studies, both from the Royal Military College. He's a graduate of the Jamaica Junior Command and Staff Course, the Canadian Army Command and Staff College, the Joint Command and Staff Program, and the National Security Program. Brigadier General Scott has been awarded an Army Commander's Commendation, 2 Chief of Defense Staff Commendations, the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal, the NATO Meritorious Service Medal, the U.S. Bronze Star, and the U.S. Legion of Merit Degree of Officer for his efforts throughout his career. In June 2021, Brigadier General Scott assumed command of the 4th Canadian Division and Joint Task Force Central. He is married to a talented and patient wife, he says, and together they are the proud parents of a daughter and son and grandparents to 3 wonderful boys. And I'll end by apologizing of of quickly going through 32 years of a tremendous career in 3 minutes. General Scott, over to you.
Thanks very much. Well, thanks very much for the very kind remarks. For me, it's a true pleasure for me to be here this evening to spend time with people that are real huge contributors to Canadian society, whether they wear the uniform or not. And I'm just truly humbled, to be able to sit beside some great Canadians, have some great discussions, and then to be able to hopefully spend some time talking to you, and hopefully I don't actually put you to sleep, but we'll see. Anyways, thank you very much for the wonderful introduction and for allowing me to partake in tonight's events. I am getting a little bit older, so I will need to put my glasses on to read some of my remarks. But tonight I want to talk to you about several things. The first thing is to really note that it is the 30th of March, and certainly the 30th of March has some significance in history. Is anyone actually born today in the room? No. Okay, so today you share, if you were born today, you would share that birth date with Celine Dion, Vincent van Gogh, Eric Clapton, to name a few. The Queen Mother died today in 2002. The Alaska Purchase was signed with Russia. 1981, anyone remember what happened tragically on this day? Almost tragically. Ronald Reagan assassination attempt. But to be honest, I think the most important thing that happened today, the 30th of March, is that a great bunch of serving members of the Canadian Armed Forces and those that support the Canadian Armed Forces, those people that are members of the RCMI, had an opportunity to get together tonight after a very long period of a COVID-19 pandemic to actually partake in breaking of bread, drinking of wine, and having some great intellectual discussions. And I think that in itself is a huge achievement that we should all be proud of, that we can actually do this. Because I think it's important, and it's really relieving, to be honest, for me and hopefully for a lot of you to be able to partake in this event. And I understand that this is probably one of the highest numbers of people that have been in an event at the RCMI over the last couple of years, if I remember correctly. So tonight I want to talk to you about a few things. I really want to heap a whole amount of praise on the Reserve Force, and that's going to be what I'm really going to talk to you about, obviously with tonight being the Army Reserve or the Reserve Force dinner. Thanks, Stewie. Yeah, we'll just drill that into the Naval Reserve there. But I'll also talk to you a little bit about, I'll touch a little bit about culture change. I'll touch a little bit about the crisis in Ukraine minutely, what's coming in the future for us, and I'll really concentrate on, the 4th Canadian Division, since that's who I represent, and Joint Task Force Central. Joint Task Force Central is essentially not only the Army component of the 4th Canadian Division, but it also brings in the Air Force and the naval components that are resided here in Ontario. And we as a team, Joint Task Force Central, respond to any sort of domestic response. And it's under that nomenclature, reporting to a separate chain of command outside of the Army, to the Joint Operations Center, that we would respond to. I know a lot of you in the audience already know that. But before I start to put you to sleep, I thought I'd wake you up with a little bit of a primer video, which kind of captures a lot of the activity that a lot of the people seated in this room have partaken in over the past couple of years. Just in case to make it foolproof. Yeah, all right. Yeah, infantry proof, definitely, yeah. Listen, ladies and gentlemen, the 4th Canadian Division, Joint Task Force Central, we've supported a number of domestic operations since the start of the pandemic in 2020. We are a professional force. We have years of experience and expertise related to working with government partners in emergency situations, and we are always ready to provide assistance should we be called upon. Our highly trained and uniquely equipped personnel, as well as our command and control structures, ensure we are well positioned to assist civil authorities in response to domestic emergencies such as floods, fires, and pandemics. Collaboration, building partnerships, and providing supporting roles, domestic operations require whole-of-government responses. Since February 2020, we have worked closely with federal and provincial governments to maintain situational awareness and to ensure an appropriate and coordinated response to the requests for military assistance as directed by the civilian authorities. The Reserve Force continues to be a vital enabler to our Army and to our Canadian Armed Forces readiness levels and our ability to support during any time of crisis. #OneArmy. The Army Reserve is a vital enabler to the Canadian Army and is key to force readiness, particularly in regional and domestic operations. The commitment and readiness of Reserve Force members as they balance family and civilian work responsibilities is essential to the ability of the Canadian Army to meet current and future security and defense needs. While supporting government requests for assistance, this division has also been conducting high readiness training in order to be ready to deploy. Always ready. The 4th Canadian Division is ready to support government responses to domestic emergencies. We are currently in our high readiness training phase, which also prepares us to respond to contingency and named expeditionary operations over the span of the next 2 years. So what exactly have we been up to? And a lot of you sitting in this room have members or have led members who have been involved in a lot of these activities in supporting Canadians over the last 2 years. COVID-19 has not done any favors for anyone, and it has certainly greatly impacted the division, not only in how it has reduced our recruiting, added stress to our daily lives, reduced or negated our ability to train, and eliminated to a certain extent our human and social interactions. Through it all, the 4th Canadian Division was called upon time and time again over the past 2 years to provide much needed support to our fellow Canadian citizens. With the Army Reserve leading, we have supported a number of domestic operations since the start of the pandemic. In March 2020, under Operation Globe, we provided 150 soldiers to assist the Public Health Agency of Canada and other government departments with the repatriation of Canadian citizens from China. Members of Joint Task Force Central supported the lead agencies with the arrival, reception, staging, and the onward movement of the repatriated Canadians at CFB Trenton. And also in this location at CFB Trenton, we stood up Task Force Preparedness, which provided reception, staging, and onward movement for 250 Canadians who were aboard the Grand Princess cruise ship off the coast of California. In March of the same year, the Minister of National Defense announced the mobilization of up to 24,000 regular and reserve force members from across the Canadian Armed Forces to be able to support the government efforts in fight against COVID-19. Approximately 550 members from across Ontario traveled to CFB Borden in April of that year, where they formed a territorial battalion group ready to respond to whatever the government requested us to do. Starting in April, we deployed approximately 450 soldiers, sailors, and aviators to work collectively with provincial partners and staff in 7 long-term care facilities here in Toronto. Premier Doug Ford said, and I quote, "We owe our brave men and women in the Canadian Armed Forces and the military families who support them, a debt of gratitude for their service to our province during this crisis. From providing relief to our frontline workers to taking care of our loved ones in long-term care homes, they have been there for their fellow Canadians in the time of need. Under Operation Laser in February of 2021, we worked in partnership with the Public Health Agency of Canada once again and the Canadian Border Services Agency to provide planning and logistical support to 7 land border crossing sites here in Ontario. In April, we stood up Task Force Presidio, a task force of approximately 80 military members that provided direct support to the Sunnybrook Healthcare Centre. Since April 2020, in response to requests for assistance by the Province of Ontario, the Canadian Rangers have been active in Northern Ontario in support of communities during COVID-19 outbreaks, power shortages, issues with community water supply, and support of the Northern Ontario vaccination efforts. This element of the Canadian Armed Forces has by far been the most busy and the most called upon since the beginning of this pandemic, and they continue to be stretched and they continue to deliver on a daily basis to those communities in need. From July to September 2021, we supported local efforts in the emergency response to the wildfires threatening remote communities again in northwestern Ontario. In support of the government's emergency response to the wildfires threatening these communities, members of Joint Task Force Central, namely the Canadian Rangers, assisted with air evacuation, helping monitor the situation in these communities, and supported the evacuees currently residing in a variety of host communities. All in all, folks, it has been unprecedented, the number of domestic operations that the Canadian Armed Forces has been involved in over the last 2 years, something that I have never seen before throughout my career, but I can tell you there's probably a lot more still to come. The bottom line through all these critical operational deployments is that you, the reserve force, have played the critical role in each and every single one of them. I can count on my hand the number of regular force members of the CAF that have deployed in Ontario on domestic operations. It has been the reserve force leading the way through planning, deployment, employment, and above all, outstanding leadership. The reserve force was definitely the driving force leading the Canadian Armed Forces response to Canadian citizens in need over the past 2 years. This is clearly the area where the reserves will be called upon time and time again to lead on domestic operations, and you have done it superbly. You should be extremely proud. Domestic operations being where you shine, reserve force must also complement or backfill our regular forces units certainly across the Army, but definitely across the Canadian Armed Forces. There may be value in some of the specific mission tasks that you've been given, but I honestly believe that some of those are just a bridge too far to actually achieve. And we need to concentrate our efforts on simply force generating the individuals, the sections, and the platoons that can augment our Reg Force units in whatever capacity you are asked to do. As you know, our numbers are drastically low, and we are struggling to get recruits in through the door and through our pipeline of training. We need the reserve force now more than ever. It should not only be for deployments, but rather for every single major exercise and training opportunity. There should be a seamless amalgamation of regular force and reserve force, always under the one Army concept. We have experienced 2 decades of intense domestic and international operations, seeing a demand for ever more soldiers to support a massive spectrum of operations while at the same time facing reduced recruitment, staffing shortfalls, a rise in demand for our junior leadership, and an ever-increasing gap between the number of tasks that we are called to do and the actual strength that we're able to deliver on those. We pile on top of that the last 2 years and the effects of COVID-19 This all threatens certainly the Canadian Army's ability to meet the expectations of Canadians to provide ready land forces both at home and abroad on operations. So this has created a bit of a crisis for the Army that cannot only be addressed through that can only be addressed through deliberate efforts to reconstitute its most valuable resources, and that is the soldier. To achieve these objectives, which is a Canadian Armed Forces priority, the Canadian Army will certainly be prioritizing individual training over collective training, while still ensuring our operational commitments are met. We are going to take a hard look at what we're doing, and we're certainly scaling back on some of those nice-to-haves or things that we would like to do, and really focus on rebuilding our force. We will develop a revised training model to better recruit, train, and retain soldiers. We will adopt an asymmetric, temporary distributed approach to ensure the swiftest and most efficient return to health as possible, while adopting better aligned cultural and professional practices. We need to focus on rebuilding our Army. All of that being said, has the situation changed since we began talking about reconstitution? Absolutely, it certainly has. 2 months ago, nobody thought that Russia would be invading Ukraine. Today we watch, all in shock, at the atrocities being committed on a daily basis. And we realize how much the world security environment has drastically changed in such a short period of time. Canada, our government, has moved quickly to support as best we can, with direct assistance to Ukraine and by getting to bolster our forces deployed in reassurance, both on the ground, in the air, and at sea. Will we be asked to do more? Potentially. And I can tell you that options are being considered. Will we see further reinforcement of Europe's eastern flank? Probably. Will we be asked to participate? We will wait and see what our government decides. For the division, the 4th Canadian Division, our role is very simple. We remain laser focused on building our combined arms teams in this our build year so that we are ready to respond when the ask comes. Culture change. This is certainly a huge topic that has come into the Canadian Armed Forces based really on the highlighting of some real indiscretions by senior members of the Canadian Armed Forces, and it has become one of our driving thrusts that we're getting after. We must become an institution that is inclusive for all. Everybody. Respect and dignity must be at the forefront of everything we do. Change starts with each of us, even for a lot of you seated here tonight. We must know what right looks like. If your gut is telling you that something isn't right, then it likely isn't. We will lead change by being inclusive and compassionate, and we will stand when inappropriate action is happening. Never pass a fault. The slogan of my regiment are outstanding words to live by. We will create a welcoming environment where everyone is respected, valued, and feels safe to contribute. We must be open to hearing and understanding different perspectives. Force 2025. I would be remiss if I didn't spend a minute or two talking about Force 2025. As part of the Canadian Army modernization strategy, Force 2025 is the Canadian Army's initiative to redesign its current structure in order to adapt to changes in the operational environment, including space, cyber, information, and other emerging domains where the Canadian Army will be primed for digital transformation. Force 2025 is just a waypoint on modernizing the Canadian Army over the years to come as we align with reconstitution efforts while remaining flexible to any strategic requirements. Key components being looked at include change to the training model, prioritizing the staffing levels of units, modernizing our structure, an improved integration model of both reserve force into regular force and vice versa. There is still much work and analysis that is being completed by people much smarter than me, but I am confident that the work going into Force 2025 will pay dividends for the Canadian Army in the long run. Lastly, the reserve component of the 4th Canadian Division is fundamental to the success of the Canadian Army as a whole. You are the biggest component. You have a remarkable storied history, and you reach out to Canadians on a daily basis much more than anybody in the regular component actually does. Be proud of your history, and be very, very proud of the outstanding efforts you have put forward. The past 2 years have been very tough on all of us. The world today is much different compared to what it was 3 months ago. We need the reserves to be ready to answer the call when it comes. This year's summer training has placed much of the onus on the reserves to deliver the fundamentally necessary individual training courses, and to build our teams and produce our leaders, to plan and deliver collective training events that are commensurate with what each of the brigades is able to produce, and to form that one Army team in augmenting high readiness exercises, leading to a year where we will move into contingency. I am extremely confident that we will be asking the reserve force to step up and lead on operations over the course of the next year, and we need you to be ready. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll close there and just say once again, thank you very much for allowing me to drone on and for allowing me to participate in such a fabulous evening amongst all of you. So thank you very much.
Will you take any questions?
Absolutely. Yeah.
General Scott will take any questions or comments you have.
Certainly.
General, my name is Ross Connell. I'm a retired Naval Reserve officer. It's gratifying, sir, to hear you talk about the outsized contribution of the reserves to the aid to civil power. And I know that probably most of the people in this room are primarily civilians and appreciate that acknowledgement. But I wonder to what extent the Canadian public knows the contribution of the reserves. I don't hear, and I know you can't speak for the Minister of National Defense, but I don't hear from the government the acknowledgement of the contribution of the reserves. What, sir, perhaps do you hear?
Yeah, thanks, Ross. It's a great question. To be honest, in the circles that I circulate in, we don't try to differentiate between regular and reserve, and we try to see us all as one Army, understanding the heavy commitments that come with being in the reserve force. And I'm truly honored to be amongst you, and I tell a lot of the people in the division headquarters are actually reservists. And, you know, for them to have a full-time civilian employment while still putting on the uniform to contribute to Canadian Armed Forces, I find remarkable. I do think we can probably do better in terms of telling our story a little bit better as to what we actually, who's contributing and where they're coming from. And I would agree that one of the ways we probably can do that is through better public affairs, where we struggle sometimes in a lot of our reserve brigades and our capability, and actually to have that capability and to tell our story. And that's an area where we can work on. But I wish I had a magic answer to tell you, but I think certainly as leaders, I know certainly the leaders in the three brigades that report to me are very active in terms of trying to promote what they're doing on a daily basis on the exercises and the communities that they're involved in. But I think certainly at a more strategic level, we can probably do a better job at that. Thanks.
Anybody else?
Sir Don Cranston, Honorary Colonel, RHLI.
Hi, Don.
Good to see you.
Again.
Quick question, and just on the Ukrainian situation. Your thoughts on surprises, non-surprises in that whole thing? Just your comments, sir.
Sure, and these are personal. So, but I think they echo what I think most of my peers would say as well. I think up until about the December timeframe, most people thought it was just a bluff, and that Putin didn't have any intention of actually invading, and he was going to try and use that as a leverage with discussions with the Ukrainians. But I think when we got into the January timeframe, early January, and we saw, we started to physically see a lot more logistics capability and medical capability showing up at the border, that we knew something was going to happen, because that was a true indicator that he really had intentions. Coupled with that was the fact that there's only a couple of months that he could really operate safely with the vehicles, heavy vehicles that he had, using the frozen ground. So I think the indicators were all there that it was going to happen within X amount of weeks. So the surprise was gone, but certainly still, their jaw kind of dropped when he crossed in and started his offensive action. Nobody wanted it to happen, of course, but I think the resolve of the Ukrainian people, and certainly the tremendous leadership under their leader, has done them very good. The Russians we've seen the poor planning, a lack of will from the soldiers to actually be partaking in what they're doing and understanding and believing in it, and a pure miscalculation with respect to their logistics planning. They clearly failed on that big time, and they're paying the price for it now. And of course, he's resorted to simple bombardment and trying to devastate the civilian population as much as possible. But I think he totally miscalculated how much resolve the Ukrainian people actually have. And I think we're going to see the tide change here. It's just whether the arrogance of Putin, whether he's going to be able to, how he's going to be able to play this to come out somehow saying that he's still victorious in it all. That'll be interesting to see if somebody doesn't kill him beforehand. So, yeah. Any other questions?
General Scott, Captain Retired Greg Patterson. Sir, you mentioned about recruiting and being a prime focus for the next little while. And we all agree, after 2 years, every regiment has suffered a little bit. Is there going to be extra money for that without sacrificing additional funds for the commanding officers?
Yeah.
Is there a repurposing of fund? I know you mentioned repurposing, but...
Right, no, thanks, Greg. So certainly the financial situation that we're living in right now, as of the 30th of March, is not all that good. It could be a lot better. That being said, I'm pretty confident that the Canadian Armed Forces is going to see an influx of money. To what use that is going to be put, I don't know. But I certainly expect that there will be an influx of money to help us on the recruiting side of the house across the board. And that is one of the biggest thrusts of our reconstitution efforts in our attempts not only to rebalance a lot of our reserve units, but really our regular force units are in dire shape as well. The problem that we have right now is the pipeline, or the bandwidth that we have to actually train those recruits, is only so wide. So we can only pump so many soldiers through that. I'm speaking really through regular force here in Saint-Jean, Quebec. That is a problem. So I know for sure that certainly regular force units are now going to take on responsibility for taking a soldier off of the street and putting him through his basic military qualification. and then his DP1 qualification with respect to his trade. We're going to see that starting in the fall of this year. Certainly in the 3 regular force battalions in this division are going to be charged with each taking between 100 and 300 recruits each into their lines in the units and bringing them along to their qualification. With respect to the reserve force, I hope that we do get additional funding that'll come that way to, allow additional recruiting to take place. But it always goes back to the same problem. We can bring somebody in from the street, but do we have enough capacity to actually train them? And that's where we always say that our junior leadership, this would be our master corporals and our sergeants, are really feeling the brunt of, or will or have felt the brunt of the pandemic over the last 2 years. And they're going to be called upon, time and time again, certainly from end of April until September of this year, to be running a myriad of courses to make sure that we've got people qualified and we've got new leaders trained. And it's difficult because we don't have enough of those people, so we've got to run enough leadership courses. So it's a vicious circle. It really is. And it's going to take us, it's not something that we're going to be able to accomplish in the short term. It's going to be several years before we get to, sufficient numbers that we had, 10 or 15 years ago.
Thanks.
Okay. Any other questions?
General, Andrew Zaytun of the Horse Guards. In reconstitution, troops, soldiers, recruits pipeline is 2/3 of the conversation. Equipment and capability is what turns them into raw resources, into functional assets. Can you share any of the equipment plans with us? Because they tend to lag in terms of capital acquisitions.
Yeah. So I wish, if you had asked me that question 20 years ago when I worked in Directorate of Land Requirements, I could spit it off the top of my head. But what I can tell you is we are going to see more money. We are going to see a commitment from the government to spend that money. I think part of our problem is the procurement process that we have is lengthy and very bureaucratic, and it takes time for us to get the equipment that we need. Canadian Army is drastically in need of ground-based air defense. We drastically need anti-tank guided missiles, amongst a myriad of other things that our other peer nations, which are now going on the eastern flank of Europe with these capabilities, we do not have them. And at times it's embarrassing, but I'm fairly confident that there'll be an influx of money and hopefully an acceleration of some of these projects. I do know that with the invasion of Ukraine, it's certainly put the focus on procurement from a government's perspective, and that we are trying to leverage, urgent operational requirements through the government to get the buy-in from the minister or from the cabinet in order for us to accelerate some of these projects. We just saw the minister made the announcement yesterday for the F-35 or the day before, which we all know that I think Prime Minister Chrétien was talking about CF-18 replacements. So it's very long, but I think the timing is right. The world events have really put the microscope on national security. I think we're going to see a lot more money influx into the department in order for us to get the equipment and the personnel and to conduct the training that we need to do.
I'd like to ask the President to come and give official thanks and some closing remarks.
So,
Did you want to say?
you can,
Would you want me to stand? I can stand.
you can stand.
Okay.
I have to stand, so you can stand. Thank you, General Scott, for a very topical address this evening. Your comments on Force 2025, the Joint Task Central, other comments that you made were most encouraging, particularly some of your responses to the questions that were asked. So I'm sure everyone in the room appreciates your candor and your forthright responses to the questions that were given tonight. You know, I have to say that to the member, to my friend, the member of the senior service, that I am a past member of the junior service, but you know, our numbers are such that we probably, you know, are the equal of the senior service, sir.
You're here.
So let me end at that point. And I didn't mention the Army at all, because we know that around here, in this room, the Army outnumbers any of the senior and the junior services. And rightly so, because rightly so. Now that I have my glasses on, I can read the comment, what I wrote while I was listening to your speech, sir. But you know, I think overall the speech was given. It was appreciated. You know, one thing I will say about some of the responses to the questions on particularly you know, rebuilding the land forces. I think the numbers for some of the defensive and weapons in anti-tank or air defense are such that it's much easier for procurement for those items than there are for frigates and for F-35s and God knows the Sea Kings, which is another story totally, for those in the sort of the combined junior service and senior service. But so I would think and look forward to, you know, we were providing items to the Ukrainians that did not meet or match the quality of handheld weaponry that other nations were giving. And so I would think because of the cost per item, those would be items that would be more easily procured and ought to be the first items that would benefit both the Army Reserves and the regular forces. So I look forward to April the 7th to hearing some of that. And I'm sure all of us do when the budget comes down. So rebuilding the forces, I think we would all in this room agree is a priority for the government and for our maintenance of our sovereignty, and that includes. I mean, I just today in the Globe and Mail references to the delays that have happened in creating an outpost in the far Arctic. I mean, it's. And I say this personally, not on behalf of the RCMI. It's scandalous, scandalous. So I am happy to say that it gives me great pleasure to present to General Scott in appreciation of making himself available and giving such an outstanding presentation this evening, one of our highly sought after limited edition RCMI medallions, which I just happen to have one here. I don't know that it's numbered, but it is something to be treasured and to be, you know, represents our appreciation for you coming this evening. So thank you very much. And I can give you back my glasses and everything else.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.